Hey everybody, Nick here, and I got a review for you today of your Boker plus Kwaiken Flipper, Kwaiken or whatever. Either way, I've been quaking in my boots to do this review. Okay, I give. Anyways, first off, let's just talk size. This is your Spyderco Delica, this is your Spyderco PM2, and here is your ZT-0452CF, which is another long, thin kind of knife like this. And so that gives you a good idea of the size. One other thing to point out is that this particular knife has actually been custom anodized, not for me, but for somebody else, and so they're not all going to come with this fun blue-purple kind of texture, which I did find pretty attractive. So that's unique. Most of them just come with plain titanium there. And there are about 50 different versions of your Boker Kwaiken, that is. Some have a flipper, some don't, etc. So don't get too confused here, but this is the Boker plus Kwaiken Flipper. Let's go into the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, okay, first thing to talk about is that this has IKBS, which is short for the Ikomakorth bearing system. And it's a very interesting system. So most knives have captive bearings that run on bearings, where basically there's kind of a brass washer in there, and the washer has little holes that contain little metal ball bearings. And so you end up with something like 10 bearings per side, maybe even fewer than that. And that's what things like your ZT-0452 or your Graham Norseman, that's what they're all running, these captive bearings. John Greamsmo makes his own bearings, and ZT's just using off the shelf. But anyways, IKBS uses a very different system, where instead of having a bunch of bearings in a washer, they just fill a little hole around the blade with a crap ton of bearings. And I'm going to see if I can show you this. If you can look through at just the right angle, maybe not. But what you can actually see in there are a bunch of little tiny bearings. I mean, little tiny things. And they're, make for a very smooth flipping action. Someplace probably in the vicinity of your ZT-0452, although it's a very different flipping action because this has a stronger detent. This doesn't have much detent, but the bearing system is very smooth. So, very impressive as a flipper, although very different than your caged bearings kind of flippers. So that's a good thing, and that's also a kind of unusual thing. I mean, there are a lot of IKBS knives out there, but I'd say a pretty heavy majority, for reasons we'll talk about later, are not. I love the design of this knife when it is closed. Right now, it's just a beautiful little minimal geometric kind of thing. I love the flatness of this top angle here. The fact that everything kind of aligns nicely there, that's good. I like the backspacer. Very nice. I like the contouring of the titanium scales a great deal, which makes it good, and the anodization really helps there too. The fit and finish is pretty good on things, but it's not perfect. I mean, there are definitely little gaps between these two, between the backspacer and the scales, and certainly on the inside and on the clip, the fit and finish just isn't very good at all. But design-wise, when closed, I really like the way that this knife looks. And then finally, it's got a VG10 blade, and VG10 is one of those blade steels that, I say is just good to go. No problems at all. So that's the good on this. It's a very smooth flipper. Well, there. Although it's a very different flipper than a lot of your caged bearing, strong detent kind of thing. This is a flipper that relies mainly on the smoothness of the IKBS, rather than on the strength of the detent matched with smooth bearings. So it's a different kind of thing. I love the design, and the fit and finish is pretty damn good, with a decent blade steel. So there's your good. Let's talk bad. First and foremost, this knife was actually a real pain to disassemble. I got this used, and I think I was the second or third owner, and it came a little sticky, a little gunky, and I tend to like to disassemble knives just so I understand them a little bit better. And this one was a royal pain in the neck, because first you need to undo these two screws, and I'm not going to do it on camera because I'm not a masochist. But anyways, first you undo these screws, and then you take off the clip, then you undo these two screws, and that loosens the titanium scales. Then you can slide those aside, and then undo a couple of screws that hold the backspacer on there, and undo the pivot screw. And then once you've undone the screws underneath the scales, oh my god, then at that point you're able to separate the halves. Now if you're not very careful, because these are IKBS and because they're basically loose in there, at that point all of your bearings are just going to fall out everywhere and roll under things, and you're never going to find them again. So it's really important that if you take apart a Boker Kwaiken or any other knife that's got IKBS going on, you need to be careful that you've got something to catch that. I went so far, because I was planning on this, I went so far as to do the final take and the halves apart inside a large plastic bag. So that way I know for damn sure none of those bearings are going anywhere. I've also heard to do it over a white towel, to do it over a cookie sheet. But these bearings tend to bounce, and even being very, very careful during the process of this, I lost 2 out of probably, 60, 40 bearings or something in there. So that's a little bit frustrating. And that also makes it very hard to clean out. If you just get the knife dirty or something like that, it drops into the mud, you can run water through there, but on a knife like, some Norseman, for instance, you can take it down very easily. You just unscrew it, and everything goes right back together very easily, too, and everything's easy. Versus a guy like this, it's kind of a pain in the neck to take it apart. I wouldn't want to take this apart tomorrow, whereas I would have no such problem with a lot of my other knives in my collection. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But that shouldn't matter for your everyday owner, because unless you get the knife terribly dirty, you don't need to take it apart. And it should come from the factory fairly well greased and with absolutely no problem. And by the way, I used the 80 weight nano oil in there to keep the IKBS in, and that worked really well. So that's another good... God, I gotta review that stuff one of these days. Anyway, so that's good. A couple of other bad things I didn't care for here. The blade shape, for me, left me cold, because it's nothing but belly. And, a little bit of belly can go a long way, and, it's okay, and with the ergos of this knife, pressing down into the belly is fine. But I just don't really care for the blade shape, and the way I show all my knives to my girlfriend just to say, hey, what do you think about this? Get another opinion. And she loved it closed and hated it once it's opened up. I just don't care for this blade shape at all, and neither did she. Another area where I don't care for is the clip. The clip just feels kind of lazy to me. This is a very heavy knife, and we'll get there. And the clip just, I don't know, it's very high in the pocket, and I feel like they could have done a lot better with the clip, especially with all of the real estate they had off the backspacer. Could have done something Graham style, I don't know. But there were much better ways to do the clip than what happened here. That's true. The centering is slightly off on this one. I can't say for sure whether that came that way from the factory or whether some other person had, screwed things up. But either way, it's slightly off. It's not bad, though. And on the whole, the fit and finish is pretty decent. The biggest bad thing with this knife is the weight. This is a very, very heavy knife. This is slightly heavier than your Grimsmo Norseman, which is also a much larger knife. And the reason for the weight, and it's almost as heavy as your Graham Razel, although this has got about an ounce on it, the Razel. And the reason for all that weight is the fact that this isn't titanium throughout. This is a titanium slab on top of steel liners, followed by a steel liner on top of titanium. If this was a single-piece construction kind of thing, where you got one titanium scale, that would be a very different affair. But it isn't, and so this becomes a very small and svelte knife that is very heavy in the pocket. And because it's so small in your hand, it just feels extremely dense. I mean, the Norseman is, fairly lightweight, but it's very light because it's spread out over a large amount of knife, versus this is very small and very heavy. So that's kind of the thing that bugged me most about carrying this guy, is just how damn heavy it is. It's not the end of the world, but at the same time, I do wish that it were a little bit lighter. So anyways, to review, IKBS and the construction of this knife makes it a total pain in the neck to take apart. And, I've taken apart a lot of pain in the neck knives. You can do it, definitely, but you gotta be really careful with the IKBS bearings going everywhere. The blade shape left me really cold, and I wish they'd done a different blade shape on this. This would have been a whole different affair. The clip is a little bit lazy. The knife is just really, really heavy, though, is the biggest issue. Now let's move on to the ugly. The ugly on this knife is one really silly thing, and that is that the flipper tab is backwards. What I mean by that is if you look at most knives with flippers, for instance, here's a Graham Razel. You've got a nice flat surface that your finger can press against to apply force to flip the knife open. Let's look at your ZT. Again, you've got a nice flat surface, even with some knurling here, so you can pop it open. You got a surface to apply force against. Your Graham Razel, flat surface to apply force against. Weird. It's almost like there's a pattern or something here. But on your freaking Kwaiken, you end up with a nice, smooth, slippy surface. There's no knurling, there's not a damn thing on here that you're supposed to apply your backwards force to. And don't get me wrong, you can do it. It's not completely out of range. But it's unnecessarily hard. Because, I can see maybe they wanted to make it look that way, but they just put a little bit of, like, jimping or something on there, for the love of God, knurling, something to give this texture to grab your hand. Because if your hands are at all wet, you're just sliding right off of that. And when you slide right off of that, you're going to miss the action. You're not going to be able to fully open it. And so this is a knife that so desperately just needs to have that little part round off, and then it would be great. Well, at least you'd still have blade shape issues. But that's a head-scratching move. I mean, you put the damn flipper tab on backwards. Even if they just flipped it around, it would be better because you've got a flatter surface, something to hook your finger against. But that blew me away. I just don't get it at a fundamental level. And on the other side here, this makes a really crappy finger guard. Your finger's going to slide right up over there. Had they put it on backwards, hey, no problem. So I just don't get it in the least. I mean, it does make for a finger choil, which is nice, but they could have done that and still done the flipper tab right. So that's the really ugly thing for me, is they just screwed that up. If somebody can point out to me why that's a good design, I'd love to hear it. But from where I'm standing, it's unlike every other damn flipper tab ever, and for good reason. That's just not the way to go. So there's the ugly on your Boker Kwaiken. This is a knife that, to me, it's got a lot of strengths, but it's outweighed by the weaknesses. Strength-wise, it's just beautiful, and particularly with the anodization, but just naturally. It's a very pretty knife, and it's nicely built, and particularly when closed. And also the IKBS is just great. I mean, it really is very, very smooth. I mean, it's as smooth as your ZTO 452, which is, almost, this is 135 and this is going 200, and it's maybe 70% of what your Graham Norseman's doing, and that's impressive. Although this, wins by a mile still. So, they've got a really good action on here, but then they put a blade shape that's, to me at least, I'm not a fan at all. There's no straight at all. It's just curve. And it's a really long blade, too. I mean, it's like 3.5 inches, and it compares to your PM2 in size. And yet it's even stabbier. So this is... I feel like the utility there, at least for me in my life, is pretty limited on the blade. I mean, it'll cut, no problem, but it's just not... Yeah, that ain't me. Add to that the fact that it's so damn heavy because they use steel liners rather than solid titanium. And, and the fact that they put the damn flipper tab on backwards, come on. But you end up with a knife that, I bought this guy, for myself in this color thinking, I'm going to love this knife and I really like this color. It kind of goes with the Norseman. But unfortunately, I just don't like it. It's too heavy, and that stupid flipper tab mistake just screws with me. So, yeah, there we are. I like the Kwaiken. There's a lot of nice stuff to it, and the pivot is just great. But ultimately, I'm going to be selling this one, and, I'm not... If you get a chance to try one and you love it, go for it. And if you love the Blades aesthetic or something, by all means. But I don't really super recommend this knife. I'd like to try one of the mini ones and see if the weight's a little more manageable, etc. But for me, it's just no gem. So, that's where I stand. I hope this has been helpful, and have yourselves an absolute wonderful rest of the day.